Beneath a sky the colour of old bone, the world of Krieg lay shrouded in its own funeral veil. The clouds had not broken in living memory. The sun, if it still lived, was no more than a faint ember glimpsed through layers of smoke and ash. The wind whispered across the broken plains, carrying with it the taste of decay and cordite, threading through the rusted skeletons of siege works older than the soldiers who manned them. Trenches stretched beyond the horizon like the scars of a dead god, their jagged edges filled with the frozen remains of those who had fought, fallen, and been entombed where they fell. In the east, the bombardment never ceased, its rhythm so ancient it had become the planet's heartbeat. The land here did not live, it endured, and so do we, brothers and sisters of this unending war. In the grey silence of this story, I speak to you not only as a narrator, but as one who truly cares for you. The galaxy is vast, cold, and indifferent, but here, now, you are not alone. Before we begin the march into the heart of Krieg's eternal night, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. He was known to his men only as the commander, though his rank was more habit than title now. No one could recall when he had last received a direct order from the Imperium, yet the parchment in his private quarters bore the seal of a long-dead Lord General, its ink faded, the wax cracked. Hold the line. That was the entirety of his mandate. He had been doing so for as long as memory served. The years, or perhaps centuries, had blurred. Each day was identical in its litany of duty, loss, and silence. Beneath the gas mask, his face was no more than a relic, an idea of a man who had once believed in victory. It was the cold that gnawed at him most, not the frozen air, for Krieg's warriors had long since surrendered their flesh to the bite of this world, but the cold of purpose. He could no longer say if the siege was still waged for the Emperor, for redemption, or simply because no one remembered how to stop. The chaplain in the southern trenches claimed the endless war was a holy penance, payment for Krieg's ancient sin of rebellion. Others muttered that the Imperium had forgotten them entirely. Yet every morning, as the pallid light shifted imperceptibly, the commander would walk the line, step through the mud and frozen blood, and watch the men prepare for the same battle they had fought yesterday and the day before. Far to the north, beyond the reach of Voxan supply, the enemy lines glimmered faintly through the perpetual haze. They were not strangers. They had been facing each other for longer than anyone could remember. Faces changed beneath masks. Names were replaced by numbers, but the war never faltered. Sometimes, during lulls in the bombardment, one could almost believe the enemy was as weary as they were, that both sides were bound by an unspoken pact of survival through destruction. But then the first shells would fall again, and the world would shudder. The commander returned to his bunker that evening to find a message waiting, hand-delivered, for the Vox lines had been unreliable for months. The seal was imperial, though aged and faint. Inside the words were brief. Maintain your position. Reinforcements will arrive. He had received these same words many times over the years, always from an unseen sender, always promising aid that never came. He placed the parchment beside the others, the pile growing like a shrine to a faith tested beyond endurance. Later, in the privacy of the bunker's dim candlelight, he allowed himself a rare indulgence, removing the mask. His reflection in the warped steel mirror was a stranger's, pale, hollow-eyed, hair long since gone to dust. The sight brought no memories, no warmth, only the faint reminder that once he had been a man, not a function. Outside, the guns thundered, shaking dust from the rafters. He replaced the mask and stepped into the corridor, the sound of boots on steel ringing like a ritual. In the trench line, a young recruit stood guard, his posture too straight, his armor still free of the pitted scars of shrapnel. The commander paused beside him. They exchanged no words. Krieg did not encourage them, but the boy's eyes followed him, searching for something the commander could not give. In that gaze, he saw the shadow of his own long-buried hope, and for the first time in many years, it unsettled him. Night came without stars. The flares of the enemy lit the horizon in brief, sickly bursts, revealing the skeletal remains of long-abandoned tanks and fortifications. The commander watched the display from the observation post, his thoughts heavy. Somewhere beneath the endless mud and ash lay the bones of those who had once rebelled against the Emperor, whose defiance had condemned Krieg to this purgatory. The siege was their penance, their sentence without end. But as he turned away, he wondered, not for the first time, if perhaps the sentence had long since outlived the crime. Tomorrow, the war would continue. The guns would roar, the dead would be buried where they fell, and the lines would shift by mere meters before returning to their ancient positions. Yet tonight, in the cold silence between bombardments, the commander felt the faintest crack in the iron of his resolve. He could not name it, could barely acknowledge it, but it was there. A question, fragile yet unyielding, that no amount of duty could quite silence. And though he would march on as always, somewhere deep beneath the layers of obedience and ritual, he knew the truth. No siege, no matter how eternal, lasts forever. The morning began not with a sunrise. Krieg had long since forgotten what that meant, but with the dull thud of distant shells, a rhythm that seemed older than the planet itself. The sky was the same grey void it had been yesterday, and every day before, ash swirling lazily in the cold wind. Along the trench line, figures in greatcoats and rebreathers moved with mechanical precision, checking rifles, adjusting bayonets, and preparing for another day in a war that had no seasons. The commander stood at the center of it all, a fixed point in a landscape without change. His breath hissed faintly through the filters of his mask, the only sound that belonged to him alone. The message from the night before still lingered in his thoughts. Maintain your position. Reinforcements will arrive. The words might as well have been etched into the very bones of Krieg, repeated across centuries until their meaning had become hollow. Reinforcements never came. He had stopped expecting them decades ago, yet each time the order was delivered, some small, unwise part of him wanted to believe. Belief was dangerous here. It could soften the edges of duty, make the long hours between bombardments feel heavier. He made his way to the southern trench sector, where the chaplain was delivering the morning litany. The man's voice was deep, resonant even through the mask, carrying over the sound of shifting boots and the soft clink of lasgun magazines being checked. "This world is our redemption," the chaplain intoned, "and our blood is the tithe we pay to earn it. Every life given in the Emperor's name washes away the sins of our forebears. There is no end until he wills it. There is no death that is not service." The soldiers stood silent, absorbing the words like a truth already known, already accepted. No one questioned the chaplain. Faith was one of the few things the siege could not strip from them. As the sermon ended, the commander's attention drifted to the farthest end of the trench line, where Lieutenant Ormund was inspecting the night's sentry reports. Ormund had been with him for decades, perhaps longer. Time had no real measure here, but the man carried himself with a certain looseness that unsettled the commander. His orders were followed, but never with the absolute precision Krieg demanded. There was a way he looked at the men, at the war, as though it were an old joke he refused to share. When the commander approached, Ormond saluted lazily and handed over the reports without a word. Several sectors had gone dark during the night. Communications failures were common, but the commander noted the pattern. The same sectors had gone silent before, always under Ormond's oversight. The young recruit from the night before was stationed nearby, rifle slung across his shoulder, eyes fixed on the enemy lines barely visible through the haze. The commander paused to study him again. The boy's armor was already streaked with mud, his posture still rigid, though fatigue had begun to settle in his stance. The boy glanced at him briefly, and in that brief flicker of connection, the commander felt the echo of something dangerous. Curiosity. It was a rare thing here, and often fatal. By midday, the bombardment intensified. The enemy's shells fell in deliberate patterns, probing for weaknesses in the line. The commander ordered counter-battery fire, but the response was sluggish. When the Vox finally crackled back to life, it carried not the expected acknowledgement, but static and fragments of words. He switched to a secure channel, one used only by the higher officers, and found it dead. Either the lines were damaged, or someone wanted them silent. Returning to his bunker, he found the chaplain waiting. "The men are restless," the chaplain said without preamble. "Some whisper of an end to the siege. They speak of leaving the trenches, crossing no man's land, and forcing the enemy to yield. Such thoughts are dangerous." The commander's reply was cold. "Thoughts are the only thing we cannot ration here. Better to let them die in the mind than on the field." But inwardly, the idea gnawed at him. He had dismissed it countless times before. Assaults always led to ruin, but lately, the notion of simply doing something had a pull he could not deny. That night, the commander walked the trench line alone. The distant flashes of enemy guns lit the horizon, revealing the jagged silhouettes of ruined fortifications. He stopped at the edge of an observation post where the land dropped away into no man's land, a frozen wasteland of craters, barbed wire, and the bones of machines. Somewhere out there, just beyond the mist, the enemy waited. They were constant as the ash, never advancing, never retreating. And yet, they knew every inch of this killing ground, as well as his own forces did. The thought unsettled him. Two armies locked together in an endless embrace, neither willing to loosen its grip. He wondered if either side even remembered the reason for their enmity. In the small hours, when the trenches were silent save for the occasional shuffle of a sentry, a runner arrived at the bunker. The man's mask was cracked, one lens smeared with dried blood, his greatcoat torn at the shoulder. He handed the commander a sealed package before collapsing into the mud outside. Inside the package was a fragment of an old field map, marked with a location deep in the northern sector, a place long abandoned, sealed off by imperial decree. Beneath the coordinates was a single word, scrawled in a hand the commander did not recognize: truth. The commander stared at the scrap of paper for a long time, the dim candlelight flickering across its worn surface. Outside, the guns began to speak again, their voices rolling across the barren land. He slipped the map into a hidden pocket of his coat and extinguished the candle. Sleep would not come that night, nor the next. Something had shifted, and though he could not yet name it, he felt the weight of it pressing against the edges of the war he had always known. The siege still held, as it had for lifetimes, but somewhere beneath the ash and ice, a crack had begun to form. And he knew, with a certainty that felt almost like fear, that once it broke open, there would be no going back. The northern sector was a graveyard even by Krieg standards. The trenches there had been abandoned decades ago, swallowed by frost and ash, until they became little more than jagged shadows in the earth. Official records called it Sector Null, a place closed under Imperial decree after a catastrophic collapse during an earlier phase of the siege. No one went there without express permission from High Command, a command that had not been given in living memory. And yet, in the cold hours before dawn, the commander found himself walking the narrow paths toward that forbidden stretch of front, the scrap of marked map weighing heavily in his coat pocket. The sky was a shifting murk of black and ash grey, the faint glow of the eastern bombardments barely touching the frozen wasteland ahead. The air grew colder with every step, the wind cutting sharper, carrying with it a smell unlike the sulphur and cordite of the active lines. This was older, fouler, like the exhalation of something buried deep. The men assigned to this sector kept their eyes averted as he passed, saluting with mechanical precision, but making no effort to engage him. Even on Krieg, where conversation was rare, their silence had a weight to it. The first trench of Sector Null yawned before him, its wooden support splintered and warped, frost clinging to rusted wire. He descended into its depths, his boots crunching on debris that had lain untouched for decades. The map's coordinates led him deeper, past collapsed dugouts and shattered firing steps, until he reached a rust-stained bulkhead sealed with a faded Imperial aquila. The lock mechanism was primitive by modern standards, but old war steel had its own stubbornness. It took several minutes of wrenching the wheel before the hatch gave way, with a groan that echoed like a dying thing. Beyond lay a tunnel, low and narrow, the walls reinforced with thick plates. The stale air inside was heavy with dust, the smell of long dead machinery. He lit a hand lamp, the pale beam revealing the markings of an older era. Sigils from Krieg's pre-rebellion days, half buried under newer coats of paint. The floor sloped downward, and the deeper he went, the stronger that foul scent became, until it clung to the inside of his mask. The silence here was oppressive, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. At the tunnel's end, he found a chamber, small, circular, its walls lined with rusted data consoles and the skeletal remains of cogitators. In the center stood a single steel table, and on it, a sealed crate bearing the same seal as his centuries-old orders. The crate's lock was simple, almost inviting. Inside, instead of munitions or equipment, he found stacks of parchment-bound files. The top one bore a title written in precise archaic script: Containment Protocol, Primary Breach Risk. The words that followed were dense with technical language, but the message was clear. The siege was not to destroy the enemy, but to ensure that no force, Imperial or otherwise, disturbed what lay beneath Krieg's poisoned crust. The enemy across no man's land was described not as invaders, but as secondary custodians, their role identical to Krieg's own: guardians, jailers, keepers of a pact forged in desperation. The war was theatre. Every death, every artillery barrage, every inch of ground gained and lost was part of a cycle meant to preserve a deeper secret. The commander's hand tightened on the paper until it creased. If this was true, then every soldier he had ever led to their death had died not for victory, but to keep a silent horror sleeping. A sound broke the chamber's stillness, a faint scuff of boots in the tunnel behind him. He turned sharply, hand going to his sidearm, but the lamplight revealed only Lieutenant Ormond, his posture casual, his eyes unreadable behind the mask. "You've been gone a long time, Commander," Ormond said, voice distorted by the filter. "It's not safe here. Orders exist for a reason." His tone was too even, too rehearsed. The commander studied him, the silence between them thick with unspoken knowledge. Ormond's gaze flicked briefly to the open crate, then back to the commander. "Some truths," he said softly, "are heavier than this world's soil. Best leave them buried." The walk back to the active lines was slow, the weight of the files pressing against his thoughts. Ormond kept pace beside him, speaking little, yet somehow the commander felt as though every step was being watched, judged. By the time they reached the populated trenches again, the wind had picked up, carrying the distant crack of rifle fire from the eastern front. The world was moving on as if nothing had happened. He returned to his bunker without another word exchanged between them. That night, in the flicker of candlelight, he read through more of the files. They spoke of a pre-imperial entity whose influence had once nearly consumed Krieg, an organism or intelligence that could not be destroyed. The Emperor himself had decreed the planet sealed, its surface locked in perpetual war to keep all eyes and feet away from the true vaults beneath. The implication was horrifying. The siege was not punishment for Krieg's rebellion, but a bargain to keep something far worse in chains. When he finally extinguished the candle, he lay awake in the cold dark, the familiar thud of distant guns echoing through the earth. His orders had always been simple: hold the line. Now he understood they were also absolute: never let the war end. But with that understanding came a new and dangerous thought. If both sides were guardians, then someone somewhere had broken the pact to send him that map. And if the pact could be broken once, it could be broken again. The next morning, as the men went about their rituals, he saw Ormond speaking quietly with the chaplain, their heads inclined in a way that spoke of long familiarity. When they noticed his gaze, they broke apart without haste, each returning to their duties. The commander said nothing, but the files burned in his thoughts, and the knowledge they carried had already begun to change the way he looked at every man in the trench. The siege had not changed. The enemy's guns still roared. The men still bled into the ash. But for the first time in a lifetime, the commander no longer knew which side he was truly on, or if sides even existed at all. The eastern horizon glowed faintly with the first pulses of the day's bombardment, a dull, relentless heartbeat that had marked the hours for longer than anyone could remember. Trenches shook as artillery shells screamed overhead, their impact reverberating through the frozen mud and steel. The air was thick with ash, the kind that stuck to hair, skin, and lungs, choking the memory of anything soft or warm. Krieg endured because it must, because it had no choice. And today, the commander felt the weight of that inevitability pressing closer, heavier than the wind that cut across the blasted plains. In the southern sector, soldiers scrambled to man their positions, the habitual precision of long training tempered by exhaustion and fear. They had seen this assault many times before. They would see it again. Yet even in repetition, something felt different. Ormond moved among the men with that same half-smile that had unsettled the commander for decades, his voice calm as he reassured frightened squads and redirected the flow of reinforcements. There was a certainty in Ormond's movements, a deliberate pace that suggested he knew the outcome before it happened. The commander could not yet name why it unsettled him so. The chaplain emerged from his bunker, chanting prayers over the troops. His words carried the weight of millennia. This day is no different from any other, except that it is a test. Your blood is the ink with which the Emperor writes his will across the skies of Krieg. Take heart, for in our suffering lies purpose. In our death, there is salvation. Soldiers crossed themselves mechanically, the rhythm ingrained, their faces hidden beneath masks, their eyes reflecting only ash and iron. The commander watched silently, noting how even the faith here was a ritual, repeated without thought of its meaning, a performance to keep despair at bay. Then came the first sign that the day would be unlike any other. A sudden delay in counter-battery fire left entire stretches of the northern line exposed. Shells struck not where they had before, but with a precision that spoke of inside knowledge. For a fleeting moment, the commander allowed himself the thought that the enemy might be changing tactics, but the pattern repeated too perfectly. Someone within their own lines was guiding them, sabotaging from within. The weight of betrayal, slow and insidious, settled over him like frost. He summoned Ormond to his observation post, the map from Sector Null clutched in his gloved hand. "What do you know of this?" he asked, his voice low, almost drowned by the echo of distant shells. Ormond's gaze flicked toward the map, then back to the commander, calm and unreadable. "It is dangerous to dig too deep, Commander. Some knowledge comes with a price the mind cannot bear." The words were polite, even measured, but in their tone lay the threat of someone who knew far more than they should. The commander realized then that the rot in his command was not hidden. It was open, tolerated, perhaps even expected. The young recruit approached cautiously, eyes wide beneath the mask, and handed over the night's log. His hands trembled slightly, though he did not speak. The commander saw the trace of fear that had begun to grow in the boy, the first cracks in the armor of innocence that Krieg demanded be shattered. "You are learning," the commander said softly, though the words were more for himself than the boy. "But be careful. Curiosity in this place is a luxury you cannot afford." The recruit nodded, understanding more than he let on. By midday, the enemy launched a coordinated push across no man's land, moving as though they had anticipated every defensive position, every trap, every misstep. Men fell screaming into the frozen craters, their bodies tangled in barbed wire. The commander's orders came too late. Supplies had been intentionally delayed. Reinforcements were missing from the sectors that needed them most. His mind raced as he moved along the trench line, issuing commands that could not possibly be obeyed in time. Every step revealed the depth of the betrayal. His own soldiers, the very ones who should have trusted him, were implicated in the sabotage, or too cowed to act. The chaplain met him at the northern trench, the ritualistic fervor in his voice now tinged with unease. "Perhaps the Emperor's plan is beyond our understanding," he murmured, glancing at the smoking battlefield. "Perhaps this suffering is required, even beyond what we have endured." The commander did not reply. Words could no longer contain the gravity of what he was beginning to understand. The war was no longer about duty, no longer about redemption. It was about containment, and someone had chosen to tip the balance. As dusk approached, a thick, toxic fog rolled in from the eastern plains, blurring the lines between friend and foe. Soldiers fired blindly into the haze, shouting orders that were swallowed almost instantly by the wind and the thundering of artillery. The commander moved carefully, guiding the young recruit beside him, aware that each step might be their last. In that moment, every instinct told him that trust was a weapon he no longer possessed. The betrayal was not subtle. It was everywhere, woven into the very bones of Krieg. Night fell with a heavy silence, broken only by the distant moan of falling shells and the faint hiss of gas drifting from the toxic fog. The commander returned to his bunker, mud-streaked and exhausted, and studied the coordinates from Sector Null again. The files, the map, the hidden truths, they all pointed to a secret buried beneath Krieg, something powerful enough that the siege had been constructed not as punishment, but as a safeguard. And now, someone within the command had endangered that balance. He stood at the edge of the trench, looking over the barren no-man's land, and felt a weight unlike any before. The siege, the endless war, the discipline and sacrifice, all of it had been a lie in service of a purpose that no soldier could comprehend. The betrayal was complete, and the responsibility fell squarely on his shoulders. The enemy might advance, the men might falter, but the real danger was invisible, internal, and far more lethal than any shell. And in that knowledge, the commander understood something he had not before. To survive Krieg, to endure its unending war, he would have to confront the enemy within first, before he ever faced the one without. The dawn arrived as a murky suggestion of light, a pale wash that barely pierced the smoke-thickened sky. Trenches shivered under the weight of frost, the air bitter enough to bite through fabric and bone alike. Across the lines, soldiers moved with the same rigid precision that had defined Krieg for generations, their masks hiding expressions that had been carved from ash and discipline. The commander observed them from the central trench, eyes narrowing beneath the gas mask lenses. Each man was a tool, each movement measured, but he knew the truth now. Tools could be bent, misused, or sabotaged, and someone among them had begun to twist the war to their own end. Lieutenant Orman approached silently, footsteps muffled against the frozen mud. The commander held the map from Sector Null tightly against his chest. "Orders have been ignored again," he said quietly. "Entire sections were left undefended this morning. Supplies were diverted. And the men, some of them hesitated, some faltered. Who did this?" Ormun's response was measured, almost casual. "There are always those who forget their duty, Commander. Some forget willingly. Some are instructed to forget." His words landed like lead in the commander's chest. There was no accusation, only certainty. Ormun knew more than he would admit, and the silence between them became heavier than the cold itself. The commander spent the morning walking the trench lines, observing men he had once trusted implicitly. Each glance, each subtle hesitation spoke volumes. The sabotage had been deliberate, patient, and precise. Someone knew the flow of reinforcements, the rhythm of artillery fire, and had manipulated it. A network of hidden loyalties, hidden betrayal, now lay across Krieg like a spider's web. And in the center of it, he stood alone, tasked with keeping the war from unraveling entirely. At midday, a messenger arrived, breathless, his greatcoat torn and caked with mud. He carried a short, encrypted communique from an unknown sender, stamped with the faded Imperial seal. The message was brief. "Proceed to coordinate Delta 7. Answers await." The simplicity of the words belied their weight. The commander recognized the coordinates. They were deep in the northern sector, perilously close to the abandoned tunnels of Sector Null. To go there was to risk more than his life. It was to confront the secret buried beneath Krieg's surface. Yet he could not ignore it. The unanswered questions, the knowledge of betrayal, demanded action. The journey north was slow and methodical. The trenches narrowed as he moved further from the central command, the air thickening with ash and the faint, persistent stench of decay. Soldiers glanced at him, their eyes questioning, fearful, uncertain, but no one spoke. Even the young recruit from earlier days stayed silent, following obediently, a shadow learning the rhythm of war. Every step was a reminder that Krieg was no longer simply a battlefield. It was a labyrinth of loyalty and deception, and he had no map. Upon reaching the coordinates, the commander found a narrow fissure in the frozen earth, half covered by collapsed planking and rusted supports. Beyond it, a tunnel wound downward, the walls slick with frost and condensation. The map's instructions were precise. Follow the passage, descend into the darkness, and confront what lies beneath. He moved alone, trusting no one. Ormund's presence was absent here deliberately, or perhaps expected. Silence was both companion and warning as he descended. The chamber at the bottom was larger than expected, a vault of ancient construction that predated even Krieg's rebellion. Machinery hummed faintly beneath layers of rust, the glow of dormant cogitators illuminating the room with a ghostly, greenish light. In the center sat a pedestal, upon which rested a crystalline container. The air vibrated slightly, a hum of contained energy that resonated through the commander's chest. He recognized the design from the files of Sector Null. The same entity, sealed away under the orders of the Emperor himself, its power restrained by mechanisms older than the siege itself. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, as though the creature or intelligence within were alive, aware, and waiting. A voice broke the silence, quiet but unmistakable. "You should not be here." The commander turned sharply, his sidearm raised, but no figure emerged from the shadows. The words seemed to come from the very air, reverberating in the chamber. "This knowledge is not for mortal men," it continued, and the hum of the container intensified. The commander's mind raced. The war, the betrayals, the endless death above. It was all connected. Krieg had not been punished for rebellion. It had been entrusted as a ward, a sentinel, world, and now someone above, or perhaps beside him, was attempting to disrupt that fragile balance. He studied the container, the glow reflected in the lenses of his mask. Inside, shapes shifted, almost alive, almost sentient, unfathomable and alien. He realized then that the enemy he had fought across no man's land was not the threat. The threat was what they had been guarding. And now, with the sabotage unfolding, that danger could be unleashed, not by outsiders, but by those he had considered allies. Hours passed in silence as he contemplated the implications. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery continued, a reminder that the surface war never paused. He felt the first flicker of doubt, not about the siege, but about himself. Could he maintain the line above while understanding the abyss below? Could he command men to die in service of a secret he now comprehended? The responsibility pressed on him heavier than Krieg's frozen mud. The return to the trenches was even colder, the weight of revelation pressing on every step. Ormund awaited him at the edge of the northern sector, calm, measured, expectant. The commander did not speak. There were no words that could carry the truth without shattering the fragile discipline of his men. The young recruit followed, eyes wide with silent questions. Above them, shells screamed across the ash-laden skies, and the world seemed no larger than the tunnel he had just left, yet infinitely more dangerous. Betrayal was no longer just a rumor, it was a certainty, and the war was only beginning to reflect it. At nightfall, the commander returned to his bunker alone. The files, the crystal, the knowledge of the secret beneath Krieg, it all lay heavy in his mind. Somewhere out there, The enemy continued its slow, predictable assault. Yet now he understood the real danger. Krieg's soldiers would die, not merely for honor or punishment, but to keep a power buried and silent. And someone in the command above had begun to unravel that silence, forcing him to choose: maintain the facade or confront the betrayal, no matter the cost. The weight of centuries pressed down upon him, and for the first time he felt the cracks forming not only in the siege, but in himself. The morning air was bitter, sharper than any weapon the enemy could wield. Trenches creaked under the weight of frost, and the frozen mud groaned as soldiers shifted their footing. The wind carried ash from the distant bombardments, the clouds a rolling grey that swallowed light and time alike. Krieg existed in cycles of endurance and suffering, and for the commander, each day brought the same relentless truth. The siege had no end, but new complications were always emerging, like cracks in a steel hull. Today, those cracks were beginning to widen. Lieutenant Orman waited at the command post, leaning against the cold steel wall, his mask reflecting the pale dawn. "Reports from the Eastern Front," he said, handing over a bundle of parchments. "Communications have failed in several sectors. Men claim seeing anomalies, equipment acting on its own. Orders are being ignored. The sabotage is spreading." The commander's eyes scanned the pages. Names, coordinates, casualties, all forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Someone, or something, was manipulating Krieg from within, steering the battle, bending reality with the precision of a master strategist. And with each calculated act, more men fell, more trenches collapsed, more hope was extinguished. The young recruit followed behind him silently, the weight of training and fear pressing on his shoulders. His eyes darted to the commander whenever the old man paused, a silent question lingering in the air. How does one fight when the enemy is everywhere and nowhere? The commander offered no answer, for he did not yet have one. The siege above ground had become only a surface war. Beneath it, in the forgotten tunnels and buried archives of Sector Null, something far older, far more cunning, was influencing every decision, every step, every death. By midday, a series of explosions tore across the northern line, throwing men into mud and frozen water. The commander sprinted through the trenches, directing squads where he could, praying that his orders reached them in time. Yet he knew, with a chill that had nothing to do with the wind, that many would never obey. Sabotage had become indistinguishable from discipline, betrayal hidden beneath layers of routine and loyalty. Faces he had known for decades stared at him blankly, some faltering at the moment of command, others obeying with a rigidness that betrayed more than compliance. It betrayed fear. Orman met him at a collapsed firing step, surveying the carnage as though he had predicted it. "They are learning," he said quietly. "Not the men, the forces beneath Krieg. They adapt faster than any human can control." The commander's blood ran cold. If what Orman suggested was true, the entity or intelligence contained under the planet was observing, analyzing, influencing. Krieg soldiers were not simply pawns in a war above ground. They were instruments in an experiment they did not understand. And he, the commander, was responsible for maintaining the facade, for preventing them from discovering the horrifying truth before it was too late. The afternoon passed in a blur of mud, gunfire, and whispered reports. Every new anomaly, every deviation from the expected, drew the commander closer to a terrifying realization. The war, as relentless and eternal as it seemed, was a fragile construct. One thread pulled too far could unravel the entire planet's tenuous balance. And the saboteur, whether human, machine, or something else entirely, was methodical, patient, untraceable. Every step taken to correct the chaos seemed only to deepen it, as though the battlefield itself had grown sentient, turning against its masters. By nightfall, thus that commander returned to his private quarters, the young recruit trailing silently behind him. The candles flickered weakly in the drafts, casting long shadows that seemed to shift of their own volition. He pulled out the files from Sector Null once more, reviewing the notes, diagrams, and ancient orders that had defined Krieg's purpose for centuries. The words now held new meaning. The siege, the endless battles, the pain and sacrifice had all been a mechanism of control, a containment system not only for the enemy beyond the trenches, but for the secret beneath the ground itself. And the betrayal above, the missing reinforcements, the diverted orders, the deliberate failures, threatened to shatter it all. The young recruit watched him quietly. "Sir, what do we do?" His voice trembled, barely audible. The commander looked at him through the lenses of the mask, seeing the fear, the trust, the raw humanity that Krieg had long tried to strip away. He did not answer immediately. There was no simple answer. To act was to risk everything. To wait was to allow chaos to grow. And yet, in the weight of responsibility pressing against him, he knew he could not stand idle. The choices he would make tonight could determine not just the survival of his men, but the fate of the hidden entity beneath Krieg, and perhaps even the planet itself. Hours passed in tense preparation. Orders were whispered, positions reinforced, and contingency plans drawn with precision. The commander moved like a shadow through the trenches, ensuring that every man, every squad, every observation post was in place, not just to fight the war above, but to guard the secret below. Outside, the bombardment continued, the sound of artillery like the heartbeat of a god indifferent to mortal suffering. Each shell that struck the frozen ground was a reminder. Krieg's war was eternal, its cost incalculable, and the line between loyalty and betrayal thinner than the ice that coated the trenches. As the night deepened, the commander stood at the edge of the northern sector, staring across no man's land. Fires from distant barrages lit the horizon, painting twisted silhouettes across the ashen landscape. Somewhere in that darkness, the saboteur moved, unseen yet undeniably present. The enemy across the lines was nothing compared to the threat growing within, and for the first time he understood fully. To survive, to endure Krieg's unending trial, he would have to confront betrayal not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible, living adversary, before the secrets beneath the world could claim everything. The storm of shells continued, the wind howled, and Krieg held its breath, waiting for the next choice to be made, for the next betrayal to reveal itself, and for the fragile balance to be tested in ways the commander could no longer ignore. The sky above Krieg was a bruised canvas of smoke and ash, streaked with the dull orange glint of distant fires. The trenches shuddered as artillery shells fell in patterns more precise than random chance could allow. It had become undeniable. The war above ground was no longer simply a matter of enemy strategy, but of deliberate manipulation from within. The commander moved through the lines, boots crunching on frozen mud, eyes sharp beneath the lenses of his mask. Every soldier's step, every hesitation, every glance was now laden with suspicion, and he could feel the weight of unseen eyes, watching, judging, influencing. Krieg had never been quiet, but now its whispers carried malice and intent. Lieutenant Orman awaited him at a collapsed observation post, the distant horizon framing his calm, deliberate silhouette. "They are probing for weaknesses," Ormond said, voice low, almost casual. "Not the enemy, ourselves." The commander studied him, the weight of years pressing into his chest. Ormond's half-smile, the same one that had unnerved him for decades, seemed almost predatory now. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, voice taut with barely restrained fury. Ormond did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the eastern sector, where flickers of movement betrayed more than just enemy scouting. "Since the beginning," he said finally, "the siege, the war, the deaths, they've been orchestrated for reasons we cannot yet grasp." The word struck like a shell to the chest. Betrayal was not recent. It had been centuries in the making. By midday, the commander walked among his men, observing them carefully. Some were oblivious to the manipulation. Others seemed to sense it, their movements faltering in subtle ways that spoke of doubt or fear. The young recruit, now hardened by months of siege, followed silently at his side, his gaze sharp and wary. Every command the commander gave was executed, but always with a trace of hesitation, as if the men themselves were torn between obedience and instinct. The realization sank in with crushing clarity. The battlefield was no longer defined by trenches or artillery, but by trust and its erosion. Suddenly, a messenger arrived, stumbling through the mud, cloak shredded, voice barely audible through the filter of his mask. He handed over a sealed package before collapsing, breathing ragged and uneven. Inside, the commander found encrypted orders, supposedly from high command, detailing a coordinated offensive in the northern sector. Yet the instructions were deliberately flawed, guiding units into traps already laid by unknown saboteurs. The handwriting was precise, too precise, and familiar in a way that chilled him. Someone above, someone within, had weaponized the chain of command itself. Every death, every strategic failure, every collapse of morale was intentional. The afternoon brought the first open engagement of the rising conflict. Enemy troops surged across no man's land, moving with an unnatural coordination that mirrored the sabotage from within. Soldiers fell in predictable patterns, barbed, wire-claiming bodies like the teeth of some great predator. The commander shouted orders, directing counterfire, repositioning squads, but the effects were marginal, the losses mounting. Ormond appeared beside him, almost silently, watching as if the chaos had been expected. "We are not winning," Ormond said softly, eyes tracing the line of craters and corpses. "We are surviving, barely, and yet the true enemy is still buried below." The commander's hand tightened on his sidearm, his knuckles white beneath the gloves. The war above was nothing compared to the war below, the hidden, ancient force that had turned both friend and foe into pawns. Night fell quickly, carrying with it a choking fog that crept across the battlefield, swallowing sound and light alike. The commander returned to his bunker, the young recruit at his heels. He spread the files from Sector Null across the table, tracing the history of the siege, the centuries of hidden manipulation. Every line of battle, every strategic failure, every act of loyalty and sacrifice had been part of a broader design, an experiment, a containment protocol, a cage for something older than the planet itself. And now, the internal betrayal threatened to unravel it all. Someone, or something, was deliberately trying to break the balance, to release what had been confined for millennia. As the hours deepened into the night, he walked again along the northern trenches, observing the skeletal remains of destroyed emplacements, the flickering of distant fires, and the silent faces of soldiers who no longer knew whom to trust. The young recruit walked silently at his side, eyes wide with fear and curiosity, reflecting the tension that had long simmered but now boiled close to the surface. Somewhere, above and below, plans intersected, loyalties fractured, and the tide of war shifted subtly but irreversibly. By midnight, the commander realized that the choices he made in the coming hours would decide not only the survival of his men, but the stability of the entire planet. The sabotage had been patient, the betrayals deep, and the enemy ever present. Yet, above all, he understood that the greatest danger was not the shells, the enemy, or the frost, but the unseen hands guiding the siege, the manipulation of trust, and the relentless, inevitable pressure of an ancient secret threatening to awaken. He stood atop the observation mound, the wind biting through his greatcoat, and gazed over the desolate battlefield. Fires flickered, trenches groaned under frost and mud, and the distant enemy lines shimmered like ghosts in the fog. The commander took a deep breath, the weight of centuries on his shoulders, and prepared for the confrontation that was inevitable. The siege had entered a new phase. Betrayal had become open, danger was everywhere, and the war above was now inseparable from the secrets below. The horizon held nothing but ash and fire, yet within that desolation, a single truth emerged. To endure, to survive, the commander would have to face not just the enemy beyond the lines, but the traitors among them, and the ancient force lying dormant beneath Krieg itself. The dawn broke grey and oppressive, a smear of light that barely touched the frozen wastelands of Krieg. Trenches were jagged scars in the earth, filled with the ever-present smoke of artillery and the acrid tang of blood and ash. The commander moved along the northern line, each step measured, each glance sharp. The sabotage had deepened overnight. Supply lines were severed, reinforcements delayed, and entire squads had gone missing without trace. The war was no longer just a surface conflict. It was layered, insidious, a war of shadows and secrets, and Krieg itself seemed to shiver under the weight of betrayal. Lieutenant Orman stood at the edge of a collapsed trench, observing the chaos with an almost serene detachment. "They probe deeper," he said softly, almost to himself. "Not the men, not even the enemy. They probe the foundation, the machinery beneath Krieg, the rules that hold it all in place." The commander's eyes narrowed. Orman spoke in riddles, yet each word carried the certainty of someone who had seen the patterns unfold long before they became visible. Every failed assault, every misfired gun, every hesitation of his men now took on new meaning. They were no longer pawns in a war. They were instruments in a cage, their actions carefully orchestrated to maintain a fragile balance, and someone, somewhere, was attempting to undo it. By midday, the enemy launched a coordinated advance across the eastern plains. Their movements were precise, almost surgical, striking at weak points the commander had not realized existed. Squads were cut down before they could respond. Trenches collapsed under shell fire, and the frost-laden mud became a graveyard for both the living and the dying. The commander moved through the chaos, shouting orders that were followed only partially, as if the men themselves were uncertain whether obedience would protect them or hasten their demise. The line between loyalty and betrayal had blurred to nothing. The young recruit from the northern sector stayed close, eyes wide, taking in the devastation. He had grown hard under the siege, yet even he now trembled before the overwhelming pattern of destruction. "Sir, how can we fight when we cannot trust even ourselves?" he whispered, voice barely audible above the roar of shells. The commander did not answer immediately. Trust had been the foundation of Krieg's endless endurance, and now that foundation was cracking. Every step he took, every decision he made, could tip the scales further into chaos. And yet, he could not hesitate. A sudden explosion rocked the central trench, sending shards of frozen earth and steel into the air. The commander's squad was thrown into disarray. As the smoke cleared, he saw Ormond moving among the men, directing, correcting, guiding, but always observing, calculating, always calm. The commander realized then that Ormond's purpose was not merely to assist him, but to test, to probe, to see how he would respond under the growing pressure of deception and threat. The weight of centuries pressed down on him, and yet he knew that the choices he made now would echo far beyond the immediate battlefield. Night fell with a suffocating fog, thick and impenetrable. The commander returned to his bunker, mud-streaked, exhausted, the sound of artillery like a ceaseless heartbeat. He spread the sector null files across the table, tracing the lineage of the siege, the hidden manipulations, the centuries of concealed betrayal. Every battle, every sacrifice, every act of valor had been part of a greater mechanism, a containment system for something ancient and powerful buried beneath Krieg. And now that system was being tampered with from within, the delicate balance threatened by an invisible hand. He moved to the edge of the trench, staring into the ashen expanse, and felt the true scale of the challenge before him. The war above was chaos. The war within was treachery. The war beneath was something older, watching, patient, almost sentient. To survive, to endure, he would have to confront not only the enemy beyond the trenches, but the traitors among his own men, and the ancient force that could no longer be ignored. As the first chill of night settled, the commander understood the unavoidable truth. Krieg's siege had entered a new phase, one where every choice carried consequences far beyond the immediate. Betrayal was no longer subtle. It was open and deliberate. The horizon burned with distant fires, and the frozen wasteland whispered with the echoes of countless sacrifices. Somewhere, in the darkness, the balance of centuries was being tested, and the commander, standing at the precipice of revelation and destruction, knew that the coming hours would define not just the fate of Krieg, but the fate of everything contained within it. He turned back to the bunker, the weight of responsibility a living thing on his shoulders. The war had become a test, the enemy invisible, the betrayals innumerable, and the ancient secret beneath the planet more restless than ever. He steeled himself, for tomorrow, the lines between friend and foe, surface and subsoil, life and death, would collapse into a single, inescapable confrontation. The frozen sky over Krieg was a tapestry of smoke and distant fire, stretched thin by the relentless artillery that shook the trenches below. The battlefield had become a blur of motion, mud and ash, where men moved like automatons, obeying orders that seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of chaos. The commander walked through the northern line, eyes sharp beneath the mask, each step measured, each glance a probe for signs of loyalty or betrayal. The sabotage had grown bolder. Entire units had vanished overnight, leaving gaping holes in the Mauti defenses, while messages from command carried contradictory instructions, each more dangerous than the last. Krieg was no longer simply a war of attrition. It was a war of manipulation, and the lines between ally and enemy had dissolved. Lieutenant Ormond met him at the edge of a shattered trench, his posture calm, composed, almost unnervingly so. "They are moving faster now," he said softly, eyes tracing the horizon, where the enemy advanced, in uncanny synchronization. Not the men, not even the machines. They move the currents beneath Krieg itself. Every misstep is preordained. The commander's jaw tightened. He had long trusted Ormund, yet the man's certainty now carried a weight that chilled him. Ormund understood the war in ways the commander had only begun to glimpse, a pattern beyond mere strategy, one tied to the ancient secret buried beneath the planet's surface. By midday, the enemy made a sweeping push across the eastern plains. Soldiers fell before reaching the barbed wire, trapped in crossfires that seemed tailored to their exact positions. The commander moved among them, issuing commands that were followed half-heartedly, the hesitation in each soldier's movements like a shadow creeping over the battlefield. Every delay, every misstep, confirmed the dread he had long feared. The true enemy was not merely beyond the trenches, but within them. Someone, or something, was guiding both sides, shaping the battle with deliberate intent. The young recruit, hardened by months of siege, stayed close, silent, absorbing the devastation with eyes wide and wary. "Sir, how do we fight an enemy we cannot see, an enemy we cannot trust?" he whispered. The commander did not answer, for the truth was heavier than any words could bear. Trust, the foundation upon which Krieg had endured, had been eroded, manipulated, weaponized. Each decision he made now was a gamble, the stakes greater than any single engagement, any single life. A sudden detonation shook the trenches, sending mud and debris into the air. The commander's squad scattered, only to regroup under his orders, though casualties mounted with terrifying efficiency. Ormund appeared beside him, unruffled, almost anticipating each move. "The balance is shifting," he murmured, voice steady. "And soon, the surface war will converge with the one below. Your choices now determine the point of collision." The commander's mind raced, understanding at last that the centuries-long siege had been more than punishment. It had been containment, a delicate equilibrium keeping something far older than Krieg itself restrained. And now, with betrayal gnawing from within, that restraint was failing. The night descended with a suffocating fog that blotted out fire and star alike. The commander returned to his bunker, boots heavy in the frozen mud, the hum of distant artillery a relentless pulse in his ears. He spread the sector null files before him once more, reviewing the schematics, the ancient protocols, the concealed orders that had guided Krieg through centuries of suffering. Each page told the story of controlled chaos, of sacrifice engineered to maintain a fragile balance, and now threatened by internal treachery. The war above ground was only a shadow of the danger beneath. He walked to the northern trench again, staring across the no man's land, and felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The enemy beyond the lines was deadly, but predictable. The enemy within was inscrutable, moving with patience and precision. The young recruit followed silently, a witness to the growing realization that Krieg's siege was no longer simply survival. It was preparation for a confrontation that none above or below had fully understood. The frost-laden wind cut through their layers of protection, yet it was nothing compared to the chill settling in the commander's mind. By midnight, the first signs of convergence began. Artillery fire became erratic yet purposeful, shifting patterns that suggested unseen coordination. Trenches were attacked simultaneously at multiple points, and reinforcements intended for critical sectors had been delayed, leaving gaps that no one could fill. It was clear the sabotage had entered a new phase, one designed to test not only Krieg's soldiers, but the commander himself. Every order, every move, every life was a thread in a vast tapestry of manipulation and ancient intent. He returned to the bunker once more, the hum of the sector null files vibrating faintly in the room. The crystalline container beneath Krieg pulsed almost imperceptibly, a heartbeat beneath centuries of frozen earth. The realization settled fully. The surface war, the betrayals, the endless deaths, they were all secondary. The true war was not fought above, but below, and the consequences of failure would ripple through generations. To confront the enemy, to endure the siege, the commander would have to pierce both the treacherous surface and the hidden depths beneath, balancing each choice against a history of calculated patience and unseen power. The horizon remained a blur of ash, fire, and fog, yet the commander understood one certainty. The next day would bring revelations, confrontations, and decisions that would irrevocably shape the fate of Krieg. Betrayal had matured into action. Secrets were stirring, and the collision between what lay above and what slept beneath was inevitable. He drew a deep breath beneath his mask, steel in his chest, preparing for the hour when surface and subterranean war would finally meet, and when the true cost of trust and betrayal would be measured in fire and blood. The horizon burned dimly, a sickly orange glow against the pallid grey sky, as Krieg's trenches shuddered under the relentless hammer of artillery. Each shell that struck the frozen ground was like a drumbeat marking the passage of inevitability, a reminder that the siege had become something far larger than mere combat. The commander moved among his men, boots crunching over frost-hardened mud, mask lenses reflecting twisted shadows of fire and steel. Every glance, every hesitation, every moment of silence carried weight. The war had evolved into a theatre of manipulation, betrayal, and ancient intent. Every life above ground was a mere instrument of a greater design. Lieutenant Orman stood at the edge of a shattered barricade, observing the chaos with a calm that unnerved the commander. "They are testing us," Orman murmured, voice low yet deliberate. "Not the men, not even the machinery. The currents beneath Krieg itself are shifting, and every misstep is calculated." The commander's jaw clenched, understanding the chilling truth. The sabotage was no longer random or opportunistic. It was deliberate, orchestrated with foresight that spanned decades, perhaps centuries. Someone, or something, was playing the entire planet as though it were a chessboard, and every soldier, every trench, every gun emplacement was a piece in the game. By midday, the enemy launched a concentrated push along the eastern sectors, their assault precise, almost preternatural in coordination. Squads were cut down with surgical efficiency, and frozen mud became a graveyard of men trapped by barbed wire and shell craters. The commander shouted orders, repositioned units, attempted counter-offensives, yet the results were minimal. The gaps in the line persisted, growing larger with every moment. It became impossible to ignore that the manipulation extended not only above ground, but into every decision, every command, every heartbeat of the soldiers. The true war was no longer fought on trenches or plains. It was waged within, in trust, in obedience, in fear. The young recruit, following closely, watched the carnage with wide eyes, absorbing the weight of betrayal and manipulation that now defined Krieg. "Sir, how do we fight when the enemy is everywhere and nowhere?" he asked, voice trembling despite the mask that muffled it. The commander did not respond immediately. Words offered no solace. Understanding alone carried the burden of centuries. The foundations of loyalty and trust had been undermined, leaving only the raw calculus of survival. each choice could tip the scales towards salvation or annihilation. An explosion tore through the northern trenches, throwing soldiers into mud and frozen detritus. The commander regained composure, guiding men to recover and regroup, but the losses mounted relentlessly. Ormund appeared beside him, unshaken, as though he had anticipated the devastation. "The balance is breaking," Ormund said quietly. "Soon, the surface and the depths will converge. The choices you make now dictate the point of collision." The commander's mind reeled. The siege had never been punishment alone. It had been containment. Now, centuries of careful equilibrium were unraveling, threatened by deliberate internal sabotage. The enemy above was nothing compared to the threat lurking beneath Creek's surface. Night fell, thick and suffocating, a fog crawling across trenches and craters, swallowing light and sound. The commander returned to his bunker, boots heavy with mud and exhaustion, the hum of distant artillery echoing like the pulse of an indifferent god. He laid out the Sector Null files once more, tracing the lineage of manipulation, sacrifice, and concealed betrayal. Every battle, every death, every act of loyalty had been calculated to maintain a delicate equilibrium. And now, with treachery festering within, the system was faltering, threatening to unleash the very secret the siege had long contained. The commander moved to the northern observation point, staring across no man's land, frozen eyes taking in the wreckage and flickering flames. He felt the inevitability pressing down, a weight more suffocating than the fog, heavier than the mud. The enemy above was predictable, the enemy within inscrutable, and beneath the planet, the ancient force pulsed, restless, aware, testing the limits of containment. The convergence of these threats was imminent, and the commander understood that the coming hours would determine not only the survival of his men, but the fate of Krieg itself. By midnight, subtle signs indicated the first collisions of manipulation and rebellion. Artillery fire shifted with unnerving precision, targeting gaps in the lines while avoiding others, as if guided by unseen hands. Reinforcements intended to shore up critical positions were delayed or diverted, leaving sections of the trenches perilously exposed. Betrayal had moved from subtlety to action, the invisible hand now tangible in its consequences. Every decision, every movement, every breath would be weighed against the fragile balance of centuries. The commander returned to the bunker. Sector Null files spread before him, the faint pulse of the crystalline container beneath Krieg resonating through the floor. The realization pressed upon him fully. The war above, the deaths, the betrayals, they were secondary. The true battle raged below, and the manipulation threatening the siege was now poised to unravel both layers of conflict simultaneously. Trust had become a weapon, and every choice carried the weight of life and death across generations. Outside, the horizon glowed dimly, the fires of bombardment and destruction reflecting off ice and ash. The commander took a slow breath, steadying himself against the wind that cut through the trenches. He understood that the next day would not merely be another cycle of siege. It would be the beginning of a confrontation where loyalty, betrayal, and ancient secrets would collide, irrevocably reshaping the fate of Krieg. Every soldier, every command, every sacrifice would matter. And at the center of it all, the commander knew, stood his own judgment and the weight of centuries waiting to judge him. The morning broke with a pallid, frozen light, barely illuminating the jagged trenches of Krieg. Smoke from distant fires mingled with the mist of frost, turning the battlefield into a ghostly, shifting landscape. The commander moved through the northern sector, his breath visible in the cold air, each step deliberate, each glance measured, The sabotage, now fully realized, had infiltrated every level of command and every squad. Orders conflicted, reinforcements were delayed, and trusted officers faltered at moments when decisiveness was critical. The siege had transformed into a theatre of betrayal, where survival depended not only on skill and courage, but on discerning who could still be trusted. Lieutenant Orman awaited him near a collapsed observation post, calm as ever, the lines of his face sharp beneath the frost. "The fractures grow," he said softly, voice almost a whisper against the wind. "Not in the enemy, they remain predictable, but in those who fight alongside us. Every hesitation, every misstep, every doubt is being exploited." The commander's jaw tightened. He had long suspected manipulation, but now it had become undeniable. Every lost trench, every failed offensive, every casualty was part of a larger design. The war was no longer measured in territory or casualties alone. It was a calculation of trust and betrayal, executed with precision beyond mortal understanding. By midday, the enemy's assault reached an intensity unlike any before. Squads were cut down with chilling efficiency, movements coordinated, as if by a single mind. The commander shouted orders, attempted counter-offensives, and redirected units, but the results were minimal. Gaps in the line widened, exposing men to fire from both enemy and hidden forces working from within. The true danger was not solely the external assault, but the treachery permeating his own ranks, a betrayal as deliberate and methodical as any military strategy. The young recruit stayed close, silent, his eyes wide, absorbing the unfolding horror. "Sir, how can we endure when the enemy is invisible and the ones we trust falter?" he asked, voice trembling beneath the mask. The commander's eyes met his, revealing neither fear nor uncertainty, only grim determination. Trust, the foundation upon which Krieg's endurance had been built, was crumbling, and every decision he made carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Each step he took was weighted with the knowledge that failure meant not only death, but the unraveling of centuries of order and containment. An explosion tore through the central trenches, hurling men into frozen mud and twisted metal. The commander's squad scattered and reformed under his precise commands, but casualties mounted swiftly. Orman appeared at his side, calm and calculated, almost anticipating the chaos. "The fractures have reached their zenith," he murmured. "Soon the surface and the depths will converge. Every choice you make now defines the point of collision." The commander understood fully the scope of the siege. It was more than punishment, more than warfare. It had been containment. And now centuries of careful balance teetered on the brink of collapse, threatened by betrayal both subtle and overt. Nightfall brought a suffocating fog, thick with the scent of gunpowder and ash. The commander returned to the bunker, exhaustion pressing against him like a living weight. He spread the sector null files across the table, reviewing centuries of plans, sacrifices, and hidden manipulations. Every battle, every death, every act of loyalty had served to maintain a delicate balance, now threatened by treachery from within. The war above had become a reflection of the war below. Every mistake amplified, every hesitation exploited. He moved to the northern observation mound, surveying the ghostly expanse of trenches and craters, the distant fires flickering like dying stars. Somewhere in the fog, the saboteurs, human, machine, or something older, moved with purpose, shaping the battlefield and testing the limits of loyalty. The young recruit followed silently, witness to the dawning realization that Krieg's siege was not merely survival, but preparation for an inevitable confrontation where trust, betrayal, and the ancient secret beneath the planet would collide. By midnight, the first signs of irreversible convergence emerged. Artillery fire shifted with uncanny precision, striking exposed positions while avoiding others. Reinforcements were misdirected or delayed, and communication lines were fractured beyond repair. Betrayal had moved from subtle manipulation to deliberate action, the invisible hand now tangible in its consequences. Every decision, every movement, every breath carried the weight of centuries and the fate of countless lives. The commander returned to the bunker, Sector Null files open before him, the crystalline container beneath Krieg pulsing faintly with a rhythm older than any man alive. The surface war, the deaths, the betrayals, they were secondary. The true battle raged beneath the frozen soil, and the manipulations now threatened to collapse both layers of conflict. Trust had become a weapon, and every choice carried consequences measured in fire, blood, and the fragile containment of forces older than the planet itself. Outside, the battlefield lay in grey silence, punctuated by the flicker of distant flames. The commander drew a deep, steadying breath, the weight of centuries pressing upon him. Tomorrow would not be another day of siege. It would be the hour when surface and subterranean conflicts collided, when betrayals and loyalties would be tested to their utmost limits, and when the true cost of every choice would be revealed. Krieg's fate, and perhaps the fate of everything contained within it, hung on the edge of inevitability, and at the center stood the commander, prepared to meet it. The dawn arrived over Krieg like a muted flame, pale light seeping through clouds of smoke and ash that hung thick above the battlefield. Trenches stretched like jagged scars across the frozen plains, filled with the remnants of countless assaults and the hollowed faces of men hardened by centuries of siege. The commander moved through the northern sector, boots crunching over frost-hardened mud, eyes scanning every shadow, every movement, every flicker of hesitation among his men. Betrayal had grown bolder, more precise, weaving through the chain of command and striking at the very heart of trust. Every order, every maneuver, every life was now part of a complex calculus that threatened to tip Krieg into chaos. Lieutenant Ormond stood at the edge of a shattered barricade, calm as ever, his gaze sweeping the battlefield with unnerving precision. "They are testing the limits," he said softly, voice carried by the cold wind. "Not the soldiers, not even the enemy. They test the structure, the very balance that holds Krieg together. Every hesitation is recorded, every misstep exploited." The commander's jaw tightened as he absorbed the weight of the truth. The siege had never been merely punishment or war. It had been containment, a centuries-long balance maintained by control and sacrifice. Now, that balance was unraveling from within. By midday, the enemy launched a meticulously coordinated offensive. Squads fell with horrifying predictability. Trenches collapsed under precise artillery fire, and every attempt at counteraction seemed preordained to fail. The commander's voice carried over the chaos, issuing orders that were followed with hesitation, each movement shadowed by uncertainty. He understood, with growing clarity, that the true enemy was no longer solely beyond the trenches, but embedded within them, guiding the battlefield with invisible hands. Each step, each decision, each command had become a measure of both skill and judgment, a test of perception and trust. The young recruit followed close, his eyes wide beneath the frost that coated his mask, absorbing the scale of destruction and deception. "Sir, how do we survive when the enemy is invisible and the ones we trust falter?" he whispered, voice barely audible. The commander did not answer immediately. Words offered little comfort. Understanding carried the full weight of centuries. Trust, the foundation of Krieg's endurance, had been systematically dismantled, leaving raw survival and strategic calculation as the only constants. Every choice could mean life or death, salvation or catastrophic collapse. An explosion tore through the central trenches, sending soldiers into frozen mud and twisted metal. The commander rallied his squad, issuing precise commands even as casualties mounted relentlessly. Ormund appeared beside him, calm, measured, almost anticipating the unfolding chaos. The fractures are no longer subtle, he murmured. Soon, the surface and the depths will converge. Every action you take now will define the point of collision. The commander's mind raced. He understood that the siege had been more than punishment. It had been containment, an equilibrium maintained over centuries, now threatened by deliberate sabotage from within and the awakening of forces beneath Krieg's surface. Night fell, bringing a suffocating fog that blotted out fires and stars alike. The commander returned to his bunker, the hum of artillery a constant pulse through the frozen earth. Sector null files lay open before him, their contents tracing centuries of strategy, sacrifice, and concealed manipulation. Every battle, every death, every act of loyalty had been part of a greater design, a fragile system now endangered by treachery. The war above mirrored the war below, each affecting the other, each dependent on the integrity of a structure now in jeopardy. He moved to the northern observation mound, staring over the desolate, cratered landscape. Fires flickered, reflecting off the frozen mud, and shadows of soldiers moved like ghosts through the trenches. Somewhere within the fog, saboteurs worked, guiding the battlefield, testing the limits of loyalty. The young recruit followed silently, witnessing the commander's realization that Krieg's siege was no longer merely survival. It was preparation for a confrontation where trust, betrayal, and the ancient secret beneath the planet would collide in an inevitable clash. By midnight, the convergence became unmistakable. Artillery fire shifted with preternatural precision, striking the exposed while sparing others. Reinforcements were misdirected or delayed, and communication lines fractured beyond repair. Betrayal had moved from subtle manipulation to overt action, the invisible hand now tangible. Every decision, every movement, every breath carried the weight of centuries and the potential unraveling of Krieg itself. The commander returned to the bunker, sector null files open before him, the crystalline container beneath Krieg pulsing faintly, as if aware of the events above. The surface war, the deaths, the betrayals, they were only shadows of the true conflict below. The manipulations threatening the siege now poised to collapse both layers of reality simultaneously. Trust had become a weapon, and every choice carried consequences measured in blood, fire, and the fragile containment of an ancient force. Outside, the battlefield lay in grey silence, broken only by flickering flames. The commander drew a deep breath, steel in his chest, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Tomorrow would not be another day of siege. It would mark the hour when surface and subterranean wars collided, when loyalty and betrayal would be tested, and when the full cost of centuries of containment and sacrifice would be revealed. Krieg's fate, and perhaps the fate of all that it contained, hung by a thread, and at the center stood the commander, ready to face it. The sky over Krieg burned with a sickly copper light as dawn struggled to pierce the thick smoke that shrouded the battlefield. Trenches were jagged wounds in the frozen earth, scarred deeper by the relentless bombardment. Yet the commander moved among them with unyielding resolve. Each step was heavy with the weight of decisions, each glance a measure of loyalty or hidden deceit. The sabotage that had grown for weeks now revealed itself in full. Officers faltered, supply lines failed at critical moments, and entire squads vanished, swallowed by the chaos. Betrayal had matured into action, deliberate and lethal, and the battlefield had become a reflection of internal decay as much as external assault. Lieutenant Orman appeared at the edge of a shattered trench, calm and unshakable, his gaze sweeping the battlefield with unnerving precision. "The fractures have reached their peak," he said quietly. "Not in the enemy, they are predictable, but in those who fight alongside us. Every hesitation, every doubt, every faltering step is being exploited. The convergence begins now." The commander's jaw tightened, understanding that the war had transformed into something beyond strategy or survival. The siege had been a centuries-long containment, a balance now threatened not only by the enemy above, but by the restless forces buried beneath Krieg's frozen soil. By midday, the enemy launched a coordinated offensive of terrifying precision. Trenches collapsed under artillery, soldiers were cut down before they could respond, and every attempt at counter-offensive seemed preordained to fail. The commander issued orders, repositioned units, yet the results were minimal. Gaps in the line widened as the invisible hand of sabotage guided both ally and adversary. The young recruit followed closely, absorbing the horror. "Sir, how do we survive when the enemy is everywhere and the ones we trust falter?" he asked, voice trembling. The commander did not answer immediately. Understanding was a heavier burden than words. Trust, the bedrock of Krieg's resilience, had been fractured, leaving raw calculation and grim determination as the only constants. An explosion ripped through the northern trenches, hurling men into mud and frozen debris. The commander rallied his squad with precise, unflinching commands, casualties mounting around him. Orman appeared at his side, calm and collected, as though anticipating every movement. "The fractures are no longer subtle," he murmured. "Soon, surface and depths converge. Every choice you make now dictates the point of collision." The commander's mind raced with the scale of responsibility. The siege had never been merely punishment. It had been containment. Now centuries of careful equilibrium teetered on the brink, threatened by treachery within and the awakening of forces below. Night fell, thick with fog, obscuring flames and stars alike. The commander returned to the bunker, sector null files spread before him, tracing centuries of strategy, sacrifice, and concealed manipulation. Every battle, every death, every act of loyalty had served to maintain a delicate balance now threatened by overt betrayal. The war above mirrored the war below, each feeding into the other, each dependent on the integrity of a system in jeopardy. By the midnight hour, the convergence had begun. Artillery fire shifted with preternatural precision, striking exposed positions while sparing others. Reinforcements were misdirected, communication lines fractured, and betrayal had become overt, tangible in its consequences. Every decision, every action, every breath carried the weight of centuries and the potential collapse of Krieg itself. The crystalline container beneath the planet pulsed, faintly but insistently, a reminder of the ancient force waiting, patient and aware. The commander moved to the northern observation mound, staring across the desolate, cratered expanse. Fires flickered, reflecting off ice and mud, while shadows of soldiers moved like ghosts. Somewhere in the fog, saboteurs, human, machine, or older still, maneuvered with deliberate purpose, guiding the battlefield, testing the limits of loyalty and endurance. The young recruit followed silently, witnessing the commander's understanding that the siege was no longer mere survival. It was preparation for a confrontation where trust, betrayal, and ancient power would collide, a reckoning long in the making. As dawn waned, the first critical betrayals emerged fully. Officers turned against one another, supply lines deliberately rerouted to create collapse, and men were forced into impossible choices. The commander moved swiftly, making impossible decisions in seconds, each one weighted with the knowledge that failure could unravel centuries of containment. The enemy above pressed the assault, but the true peril lay within Krieg itself, where treachery had become a weapon as precise and deadly as any artillery shell. By the day's end, the surface and subterranean conflicts had begun to converge. The battlefield had become a crucible of loyalty, betrayal, and endurance, where every choice carried eternal consequences. The commander understood that the coming hours would determine not only the survival of his men, but the fate of Krieg and the ancient secret beneath it. The horizon burned with distant fires, the frost-laden wind carried whispers of sacrifice and doom, and every soldier, every officer, every action moved the siege closer to a point of no return. The commander drew a deep breath beneath his mask, steel in his chest, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The fractures had matured into irreversible action, betrayals were manifest, and the ultimate test of loyalty and resilience was at hand. Krieg would not merely endure or fall, it would be forged anew, in fire, blood, and the reckoning of centuries-old secrets awakened. The battlefield of Krieg had transformed into a hellscape of fire, ice, and shattered steel. Dawn struggled to break through the thick veil of smoke, the sun a pale, sickly disk, casting a copper hue over the frozen trenches. The commander moved among the shattered defences, boots crunching over frost and debris, every glance calculating, every step measured. Betrayal had escalated beyond subtle subversion. It had become action. Officers faltered, supply lines crumbled, and entire squads disappeared into the chaos, leaving gaps that neither strategy nor courage could fully cover. The siege was no longer a matter of survival. It was a crucible where loyalty and treachery clashed with relentless force. Lieutenant Orman appeared beside him, calm and precise despite the devastation surrounding them. "The fractures have reached their apex," he murmured, voice almost swallowed by the wind. "Not in the enemy, they are predictable, but in those who should fight beside us. Every hesitation, every misstep, every wavering choice is being exploited. The convergence is inevitable." The commander's jaw tightened. He understood fully now that Krieg had never been merely a theatre of war. It had been containment, a centuries-long balance designed to restrain forces older than memory. That balance was fracturing, threatened by both internal treachery and the restless power sleeping beneath the frozen ground. By midday, the enemy launched their most precise assault yet. Trenches collapsed under coordinated bombardments. Soldiers were cut down before they could even return fire, and every counter-offensive seemed preordained to fail. The commander shouted orders, maneuvered units, and attempted to hold the line, yet the results were minimal. Gaps widened, exposing men to death from both the visible enemy and the unseen manipulations guiding the battle. The young recruit, eyes wide and frozen by fear, followed close. "Sir, how can we endure when the enemy is everywhere and the ones we trust falter?" he whispered. The commander's eyes met his, revealing the grim certainty that words could not capture. Trust, the foundation of Krieg's endurance, was shattered, leaving only calculation and steel resolve. An explosion ripped through the northern trenches, sending men into frozen mud and debris. The commander rallied his squad with unwavering precision, but casualties mounted with terrifying speed. Ormund remained by his side, calm as if anticipating each turn of fate. "The fractures are no longer subtle," he said softly. "Soon, surface and depths collide. Every decision you make now dictates the point of impact." The commander understood. The siege had never been punishment alone. It had been containment, an equilibrium maintained over centuries, now threatened by deliberate treachery and the awakening of forces beneath Krieg's surface. Night descended, bringing a suffocating fog that swallowed fire and star alike. The commander returned to his bunker, Sector Null files spread across the table, tracing centuries of strategy, sacrifice, and hidden manipulation. Every battle, every death, every act of loyalty had been part of a delicate balance, now imperiled by overt betrayal. Above and below, Krieg teetered on the edge of collapse, each movement feeding into the other, each decision critical to survival. By midnight, the convergence became unmistakable. Artillery fire shifted with preternatural precision, striking exposed positions while sparing others. Reinforcements were misdirected or delayed, and betrayal manifested in brutal, tangible acts. Every decision, every movement, every breath carried the weight of centuries and the potential destruction of Krieg itself. The crystalline container beneath the planet pulsed faintly, its presence a reminder of the ancient, patient power waiting to be unleashed. The commander ascended to the northern observation mound, surveying the desolate, cratered expanse. Fires flickered across frozen mud, shadows of soldiers moving like phantoms through the fog. Somewhere in the chaos, saboteurs, human, machine, or older still, maneuvered with deliberate intent, guiding the battlefield and testing the limits of loyalty. The young recruit followed silently, witnessing the commander's realization that the siege was no longer about mere survival. It was preparation for a confrontation where trust, betrayal, and ancient power would collide in a reckoning long in the making. Critical betrayals emerged fully as the day wore on. Officers turned against each other, supply lines collapsed deliberately, and soldiers faced impossible choices. The commander acted with ruthless precision. Every decision weighted with the knowledge that failure could unravel centuries of containment. Enemy assaults pressed relentlessly, yet the true danger was embedded within Krieg itself. Treachery had become a weapon as lethal as artillery, a force capable of shaping the battlefield and sealing the fate of all who stood upon it. By the end of the day, surface and subterranean conflicts collided. The battlefield had become a crucible where loyalty, betrayal, and endurance were tested beyond measure. The commander understood that the coming hours would determine not only the survival of his men, but the fate of Krieg and the ancient secret buried beneath its ice and stone. The horizon glowed with distant fires, frost-laden winds whispered of sacrifice and doom, and every soldier, officer, and action drew the siege closer to its inevitable point of no return. The commander inhaled deeply beneath his mask, steel in his chest, ready for the confrontation that would define the fate of the planet. Betrayals had matured into irreversible action. Loyalty was stretched to its limits, and the ultimate test of Krieg's endurance was at hand. The frozen plains, scarred by centuries of conflict, would bear witness to decisions forged in fire, blood, and the awakening of secrets long thought dormant. The horizon over Krieg glowed with a sickly, fading light, the last remnants of the copper sun casting long, twisted shadows across the frozen wasteland. Trenches, shattered beyond recognition, stretched like scars across the frozen plains, filled with the husks of those who had fallen in the centuries-long siege. The commander stood atop a ruined observation mound, boots crunching over ice and debris, eyes scanning the battlefield that had become both tomb and testament. The betrayals, the sacrifices, the unyielding assaults, they had all led to this moment. The siege was no longer merely a struggle for survival. It had become the fulcrum upon which the fate of Krieg and the ancient power beneath it balanced. Lieutenant Orman appeared beside him, silent and composed as always, his presence a calm anchor against the storm of chaos. "It ends tonight," he murmured. "Every fracture, every act of treachery, every choice you have made has brought us here. There is no retreat, no redemption beyond this point." The commander nodded, understanding fully the weight of those words. The centuries of containment, the delicate equilibrium maintained through sacrifice and strategy, now converged upon a single pivotal hour. The choices made in these final moments would determine not only survival, but the ultimate fate of Krieg itself. By midday, the enemy's forces surged with relentless precision, coordinated and merciless. Trenches collapsed under calculated bombardments, squads were annihilated in seconds, and reinforcements were delayed or misdirected in a cruel twist of fate. Every movement, every decision, every breath carried consequences of immeasurable scale. The young recruit, standing close to the commander, could scarcely comprehend the weight pressing down upon them. "Sir, how do we endure this?" he whispered, voice trembling beneath the frost-coated mask. The commander's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. Survival was no longer a matter of strategy alone. It was a matter of endurance, of will, and of the ability to wield betrayal and loyalty as instruments in a war that transcended generations. Explosions tore through the northern trenches, hurling men into mud and shattered steel. The commander rallied his forces, issuing orders with the precision of someone who had seen the patterns of war unfold over centuries. Ormund moved beside him, unflinching, as though he anticipated every turn of the battle. "The fractures have matured," he said softly. "Soon, surface and depths collide fully. The fate of Krieg and all it contains will be decided by what happens next." The commander's heart, long tempered by centuries of duty and sacrifice, felt the crushing weight of inevitability. The siege had never been merely punishment. It had been containment, a balance maintained through careful calculation, now threatened by forces both internal and ancient. As night fell, the final convergence began. Artillery fire struck with unerring precision, trenches were obliterated, and the enemy pressed forward relentlessly. Betrayals within the ranks manifested in decisive, lethal ways. Officers turned on one another, supply lines failed, and squads faced impossible choices. Every action was magnified, every decision tested against the limits of endurance, trust, and morality. The commander moved through the chaos, a fulcrum of authority and resolve, aware that every step could mean salvation or annihilation. Beneath Krieg, the crystalline container pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, resonating with the surface conflict in ways both terrifying and beautiful. The ancient force within stirred, patient and aware, responding to the fractures above. It was a presence beyond comprehension, a power older than empires, awaiting the moment when centuries of containment would either hold or shatter. The commander understood that the final act was at hand. The war above and the awakening below would collide in a crescendo that could not be undone. By midnight, the decisive moments arrived. The surface and subterranean forces converged fully, each shaping the other. Loyalty and betrayal reached their ultimate test. Sacrifices multiplied, and decisions were made that would echo through centuries. The commander, standing amidst the shattered battlefield, felt the full weight of his choices. He had borne the burden of centuries, maintained a delicate balance of power and loyalty, and now faced the cost of every decision, every life lost, every act of betrayal. The young recruit, once wide-eyed and fearful, now stood silent, witnessing the culmination of the siege, understanding for the first time the magnitude of what had been endured. Fires flickered across frozen mud, shadows danced among ruins, and the wind carried whispers of sacrifice and inevitability. The commander, eyes reflecting both resolve and sorrow, knew that the siege of Krieg had reached its conclusion. It was not victory in the conventional sense, nor was it defeat. It was the consequence of centuries of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the immutable weight of time. As the first pale light of a new dawn touched the horizon, the battlefield lay quiet, save for the faint pulsing of the crystalline container beneath. The commander, alone among the ruins, understood the truth. Empires rise and fall, loyalty is tested and broken, and immortality is a burden heavy with loss. Krieg had endured, but at a cost that would echo across generations. The frost and fire, the betrayals and sacrifices, the manipulations and courage, all had converged into a singular truth. The siege had ended, yet the consequences would linger forever, etched into the bones of the planet and the memories of those who had survived. The commander lowered his gaze, the weight of centuries pressing upon him, knowing that the story of Krieg was now complete. The fires would fade, the ice would remain, and the ancient secret beneath the planet would pulse quietly, waiting, patient, eternal. The siege was over. The empire, the war, the betrayals, they had reached their end. And in that quiet aftermath, Krieg stood as a monument to endurance, sacrifice, and the inexorable march of fate.